Nick Gauntlet, Private Night, by Austin McKinley. Chapter 2. Torches glare in the smoke as a bucket line of townsfolk put out the smoldering ruin of the smithy. I stand beyond the concealed door in what is unquestionably a laboratory with Sheriff Railgar, the Duke's lieutenant. Railgar covers his face with his arm against the stench, obscuring his small salt and pepper goatee as his men kick over braziers, jars, chemical containers. "You never saw this room before?" Railgar asks me. "Probably never will once your bulls are done with the china," says I. "And the person you say you ran into?" "Slight. Wiry," I tell him. "Smelled funny. Probably French." "Maybe he was lucky," says Railgar. He looks around and coughs. "Looks to me like Marcus was one of them amateur alchemists, led into gold sort of thing." "Amateur?" says I. "They stumble on unstable compounds, I hear." In answer to my look, he elaborates. "My boss is one, you know." "You make it an accident?" "What do you want me to do, Nick?" Railgar says. "It's a small town. I put it out there's a small Frenchman blowing up blacksmiths. I got bigger problems. So yeah, an accident, for now." "I never knew Marcus to be mixed up in all that," I tell Railgar. "And I worked with him." Railgar coughs again. "It's darker than a Moor's ass tonight. No moon. Have to come back in the morning after the smoke clears." But he doesn't. We bury Marcus the next day in the claustrophobic, weed-grown cemetery of the parish church. Only it's not much of a funeral because of the interdict. Bishop Saltpeter, a white-haired crone in a peaked mitre, lurks among a knot of white-robed monks, apart from the rest of us mourners graveside. He watches the pallbearers lower the casket, but makes no move to speak. King John refused the Pope's man for Archbishop of Canterbury, see? And the Pope put the whole country on notice. Means no weddings, no baptisms, no communion, no confessions, and no funerals. It's up to us to put our friends and loved ones in the ground. Church is closed for business. Among the crowd are Cadmia and Warren, Sheriff Railgar, and standing apart, two women. One's an aristocrat in fine frock, maybe mid-30s. The other holds a withered rose. She's a decade younger, probably the maidservant. I'm in a kind of haze brought on by grief and frequent nips from my pewter hip flask. Cadmia pats my shoulder, takes the flask away. The crowd stands around the grave, unsure how to proceed. "Isn't right," I say to Cadmia. "Somebody ought to say something. Somebody ought to do something." I look around, but no one moves. "Fine," says I, weave to a nearby monument and hoist myself up. "It's not fair," I tell them. "Marcus was a good man. Clever man. Best blacksmith I ever knew. A regular Tubal Cain. Did things with iron you'd give your ball peen for. He made me this." I pull out the broken crossbow and stare at it. It's not working right now, but that's not the point. What was I saying? Oh yeah. I put the crossbow back in my coat. The crowd grumbles. "He deserves more than this," I say. "He deserves a real eulogy. And I can't give him that. But I can give him justice. And I will. Because Marcus was murdered." "No," says a woman in the crowd. "Yes, he was," says I. "I'm gonna find out by whom. I've got experience in these things. I'll find who's responsible. Swear to God." I make the sign of the cross, spit on the ground, and glare at them all. Especially Bishop Saltpeter. The rest of that day, I canvass the town. I ask at every door if anyone saw or knew anything about what happened to Marcus. I get the usual responses to a man like me. Hostility, resistance, ignorance, and ridicule. I hand the peasants little parchment rolls as if the poor sots can read and say, "Find me at this address if you change your mind." Mostly they shut the door in my face. Some open it back up, take the parchment, throw it on the ground, and shut the door again. In short, it's the kind of day after which a man needs a drink. I have a lot of those. At sunset on my way home, I noticed two cloaked figures dogging my steps. Could be about any number of things, none of them good. My last run-in with a cloaked figure didn't work out well at all, so I'm sure not going to let these two get the drop on me. I trudge up the stairs, try to act casual, go through my door. I crank the gear on my wooden window louvers and look out to see the two figures enter the tower's base. I push a button on my table, and a spring-loaded contraption strikes flint against steel to light a self-trimming oil lamp. I hang my coat and hat on a stand between the lamp and the door, so to cast a Gauntlet-shaped silhouette on the door's leaded glass window, then stand against the wall out of sight. A knock on the door. "What?" I shout. "The sign on the door says Private Night," comes the reply. A woman's voice. "Yeah, as in, go away." "I thought you were some kind of man for hire. I can pay." I open the door and see the two ladies from earlier that day, their hoods thrown back now, but cagey all the same. "You were at the funeral," says I. "So were you," says the tall one, the dame. "Made a bit of a scene, fair to say." I rub bleary, bloodshot eyes. "I'm Lady Antimony of Calomel," the tall one introduces herself. "The Duke's wife? Either I'm coming up in the world or you're going down," I tell her. "You said you have experience," says Antimony. "Something you want to tell me?" says I. "My maid does, don't you, Galena?" Antimony drags Galena front and center. The girl looks from me to Antimony, cowed. "It's okay," I tell her in spite of myself. I don't like to see a woman terrified. "I was in confession, sir," she says. "I overheard Bishop Saltpeter talking to one of his men. He told them, sir—" She looks to Antimony for reassurance. "Go on," Antimony says. "We have to stop the alchemist," he said. "Then what happened?" I prompt. She tugs at her skirt. "I followed him, sir, far as the smithy. Then I ran to tell my lady." "So?" I ask. "So a church agent was the last known person to see Marcus the blacksmith alive," Antimony says, haughty. "Don't you find that interesting?" "Guess you should come in," says I. The women follow me in. I move the hat stand, flop into a wooden chair to face Antimony and Galena. "Did you invent all these?" Antimony examines the devices on my shelves. "Marcus helped," I tell her. "Curious." She spins a small metal part on one. I put my feet on the rough-hewn table and roll a cigarette. "I'm a curious guy," I say. "But why are you telling me this?" "Because, like you," Antimony clears her throat, "I believe it was not an accident. It may even have been a church hit. And if you're looking into it, you can make it worth your while to keep me informed." I lean back in my chair, finally in familiar territory. This is what I'm good at. "What's your interest?" I ask her. "Never mind that," she says. "Will you do it?" Very cagey. "The Duke keeps you in cosmetics, doesn't he?" I say by way of changing the subject. "Paints, dyes, that sort of thing?" Antimony says, "So?" "Make him himself." I lean forward. "Everyone knows what my husband is." Antimony almost snaps. "That's not the point." "Just like to have everything up front," says I. "Well, if the Duke's really an alchemist, my fee shouldn't be a problem. I get 3 ducats, or 6 chickens a day, plus expenses. I prefer the ducats." "Bit steep, aren't you?" Antimony raises an eyebrow. "The code says I have to serve ladies with chastity," I tell her, "not charity." "What code is that? Surely not the knight's." "Old habits." I cut her off. "My lord has all the gold, or says he does." Antimony looks at Galena. "But I have something else that might interest you, if my sources are correct." Galena takes a flagon from her blouse, sets it on the desk. I uncork it. Sniff. "Aqua vitae," Antimony tells me. "Water of life?" I ask. "It's a good year," says Galena. "You think so?" I put back the cork, set it aside, and stare at them. "I'll find the killer," I go on. "Bring him to justice. You want to keep me in Brandywine for doing it? That's your lookout?" "Is that a vow, knight?" Antimony wants to know. "It's a deal anyway," says I. "You want to be careful with vows." "Tell me about it." Antimony nods. "Now, if you ladies will excuse me." I stood up. I've got a date with a pile of straw. I nod at the hay in the corner. The women get up, head for the door. At least we left something to keep you warm, Antimony says. It's cold comfort, lady. Let's not mince words. As you wish, says Antimony. I move gingerly around my table, grab the bottle. Oh, one other thing, I eject before they reach the door. The two ladies pause and turn. How did you go to confession? I ask Galena. What with the interdict? She blinks. It was September 29th, she says. In answer to my look, she goes on. The feast of St. Michael, for the settling of accounts. The bishop still has to hear confession on the holy days of obligation. Oh, says I. Course. Guess it pays to know your church calendar. The women leave. I sit on the pile of straw in the corner and uncork the bottle. Marcus said it was the head. But the head of what? The town? The guard? The local parish? Or one of its members? I take a long pull. It's hard to believe Marcus survived the siege of Acre, but now he's dead. Roasted like a Michaelmas goose. Must have owed one hell of a debt. But to whom? I'm in the smithy at the remains of the workbench, trying to repair my broken crossbow when Sheriff Railgar clambers into the ruin and finds me. The burned timbers are brittle and glisten like caramelized sugar. Neighbors told me you were prowling around in here, he says. There ought to be a law, I retort. Nick, this isn't going to go hard, is it? Railgar asks. Hard as it needs to, says I. He was my friend, Railgar. My partner. Besides, I thought you were going to come back yesterday. He just glares and after a minute says, I trust you didn't move too much. I hold up a piece of the crossbow and say, look for yourself. I'll just be a minute. Railgar sighs, glances around. A golden gleam in the early morning sun catches his eye. Huh, he says, bends close to the smoke-blackened wall and inspects the tiny clockwork cogs stuck in it. Gears, he says. Half buried in the wall from the force of the blast, I'd say. Railgar takes out his belt knife, digs at it. Know what that means? I say. I don't look up. Could have been on the workbench when... No, it wasn't an unstable compound. It was a device. How about those scraps of paper? Any kind of writing you recognize? Railgar notices the ashy bits of parchment I indicate. He picks some up. They're covered in strange, archaic script. Some are alchemical symbols, but the rest... Does it matter? The man could barely read. Didn't need to. Job like his. Who'd want to kill an alchemist? Railgar shakes his head. Well, says I, the usual motivators are gold, power, and l'amour. Alchemists supposedly possess the secret to all three, so that narrows the list of suspects to pretty much everyone in town. And you've been asking around, says Railgar. I concentrate on my crossbow. Marcus was well liked, I tell him, but he was never suspected of alchemy. Not smart enough. Been meaning to talk to you about that. He may not have been smart, but you are. I'm trying to run an investigation here, and this isn't helping. He tosses a cigarette-sized roll of paper on the table. Practically raining parchment, I observe. This one's got your name on it, says Railgar. Says to look you up. People are uneasy. The Duke has me cracking down until the villain is caught. Search the barns, empty the streets, that sort of thing. They can't read this, but they know it means trouble. That makes it my problem. People aren't stupid, says I. Wind blows their door down. They know which way it came in. Who'd kill an alchemist? My money's on another alchemist. God, your mouth, Nick. Railgar shakes his head again. The Duke has me beating every bush and bushel. He's looking for a scapegoat. I don't need to find any more of those. He jabs a finger at my parchment. I hold the partly reassembled crossbow together as I adjust the tension. Railgar goes on. Maybe you should help me instead of lone wolfing it all the time. The crossbow flies apart with a loud snap, traps my fingers. Damn it! I kick the table and howl in rage. It doesn't make me feel better. I shove the remaining pieces of the crossbow aside and pick up a singed short blade from the rack of similar implements scattered into piles on the earth floor. You're a civilian now, Nick, Railgar warns me with a look. You know I can't let you bear an arm. Knives and crossbows don't count as arms in the classical sense. Swords do. Only a knight can carry one of those. Commoners aren't allowed. It's not a sword, says I. It's a basilard, also known as a Swiss dagger. I demonstrate. It's got a narrow tang, no crossguard, and a blade under 14 inches. It's legal. Barely, says Raelgar. I wedge the blade in my shoulder holster. We're not going to quibble about length, are we? The sheriff and I share a lopsided smile. I don't think it was the Duke. Raelgar holds up the parchment scraps. Doesn't fit. Come talk to him. You'll see.